Okay, so what we're looking at here is the election of Nixon and how he handles the Vietnam conflict. I believe the next chapter talks a little bit more about Nixon from a political perspective, and this kind of focuses more on Vietnam. Um, Now, Nixon's election is a result of the Democratic Party being kind of fractured, a lot of it due to the Vietnam War. And Nixon pretty much campaigns on one of the promises of that he will kind of get us out of Vietnam, that he'll kind of fix things, when really Nixon had the intention of winning the war and kind of expanding the war. Now, his national security assistant and key foreign policy advisor is a guy by the name of Henry Kissinger. And for those of you that are Bernie Sanders people, the name should ring a bell since Bernie Sanders made a comment at one of his debates that he would not be taking any foreign policy advice from Henry Kissinger. Henry Kissinger was not his friend, and so forth. Henry Kissinger is one of the more famous uh, foreign policy national security advisors this country has ever had. He made some very controversial decisions, but his foreign policy experience is unbelievable. Now, Nixon, one of the first things he does actually doesn't really have to do with Vietnam, but he has Henry Kissinger and his foreign policy team begin setting up secret negotiations with the Chinese. And the Soviets and the Chinese, though both were communist, they adhered to different versions of communism. The Soviets were industrial, the Chinese were more agriculturally focused. And the two sides had also kind of broke off on a couple other issues, and Nixon kind of saw an opening. And so what happens is Nixon has these negotiations set up with the Chinese government, and they arrange for a state visit. And Nixon ends up becoming the nation's first president to set foot in China since the communists had taken control in February of 1972. And the meeting was basically Nixon kind of reaching out to the Chinese, trying to build relations with them, particularly with trade relations. And the other part of this policy was kind of trying to make the Soviets jealous. The thought was, if the Soviets see us reaching out to the Chinese, then the Soviets will say, well, we want to have, we'll be willing to talk to you as well. And that's kind of what Nixon was trying to do. He was kind of trying to get the Soviets to react to this. And it kind of works because in May of 1972, Nixon visits Moscow, where the Soviets and the Americans begin discussing what becomes known as SALT, the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks. And these talks were geared towards limiting the number of nuclear weapons that each side would have, and possibly discussing maybe downsizing some of the arsenals. But of course, as we've talked about, a lot of times you could downsize your arsenal and get rid of obsolete equipment, and you had 10 nuclear weapons that could cause just as much damage as the 500 that you got rid of. Okay, now Vietnam with Nixon, as I said, he comes in kind of widening the war. Him and Kissinger, it's from everything that I've read, it actually seems like they actually believe that it's possible for them to win the war, pretty much forcing the North to come and negotiate. And so their approach to Vietnam is continue the idea of Vietnamization, strengthen the South Vietnamese military and government, and keep preparing them to take over operations. That way, they basically have to fight and win their own war. The other thing was to try and kind of push down on that anti-war movement at home, because that was causing a lot of public anger with the administration. It was causing Americans to not support the war, and Nixon felt that it was in his best interests to try and kind of thwart this anti-war movement. The other thing is to negotiate with North Vietnam and the Soviet Union. Maybe we could reach out to the Soviets and they could reach out to North Vietnam, and at the same time conducting a massive bombing campaign. Nixon called this going for the jugular. Basically, we'll do a two-pronged strategy of negotiating while at the same time bombing them back into the Stone Age. Now, the other thing that Nixon does, though, is he begins bombing Cambodia. And of course, we've talked about Cambodia had some of the Ho Chi Minh Trail running through it, and the North Vietnamese army were hiding in Cambodia because they knew they really couldn't get touched there. Nixon expands it even further in 1970 when he orders a joint U.S. ARVN, and ARVN, remember, are the South Vietnamese military, invasion of Cambodia. So now we're not only bombing Cambodia, but U.S. troops are entering into Cambodia. And so what this has done is expand the size and scope of the war into something much larger than it had been when Nixon came in office. So instead of kind of drawing down the war, Nixon is actually expanding it. After that invasion into Cambodia, anti-war protests are going to get even bigger and more aggressive, and you have a very famous one at Kent State University in Ohio. And the students begin attacking the ROTC building, and the Ohio National Guard gets called out to pretty much put down the riots and to provide peace. What ends up happening is a major confrontation happens on the campus of the university, and the Ohio National Guard opens fire. They kill 4 students. In addition, at Jackson State College in Mississippi, police kill 2 students involved in anti-war protests there. Now, one of the killers for Nixon is going to be the Pentagon Papers. And this was basically a study that had happened within the Pentagon and the Department of Defense, pretty much saying that we were losing the war in Vietnam, that our strategy was not working, that we were basically ineffective. Now, the Pentagon had known about this for quite a while, yet they kept it secret. And so when these papers get published, all of a sudden people realize that the credibility gap was absolutely true and that they really were lying to the American public. And after the spring of 1971, the protests kind of calmed down. They do continue. But one of the events that happens that also kind of fuels anti-war sentiment was an event known as the My Lai Massacre. And a guy named Lieutenant William Calley basically led a U.S. Army unit into the My Lai hamlet area. And what they do is they end up killing, I think, close to 300 and wounding 500 men, women, and children in this village. I think they had been ambushed like the previous evening or something. And when they roll into the village, they're thinking that like some of these people are Viet Cong sympathizers, but really what it is was just, these guys were fed up with the war. They were fed up not knowing if the enemy, if these farmers were the enemy or not. And Cali, by all accounts, just seems like he was kind of a scummy guy. And what they do is they just, like I said, line up these people and just start shooting them. And it's only when a U.S. helicopter flying over sees what's happening and they literally land the chopper between Callie's men and the civilians that the massacre stops. And that pilot reports Callie and his men, and the guys are brought in for military trials, and the government tries to cover up the trial and the massacre. People don't actually know about the massacre until like months after it's actually happened. Um, let's see, there's Kent State, and that's photographs from My Lai. So Nixon and Kissinger continue to go for this jugular, thinking that if they keep bombing the North, then it'll bring them to the negotiating table. The peace talks stall, but then Nixon orders an expansion of the bombing, and what happens is that a lot of our pilots are captured, bombers are shot down, fighter planes are shot down, but it does force the North Vietnamese to come to the negotiating table. So in a way, you could almost argue that that jugular diplomacy does work. And Nixon, he announces that the agreement agreed upon between us and the North Vietnamese, he says, is peace with honor. Meaning, I'm trying to get us out of this thing with honor, but the actuality of it was we were just trying to get out of this thing as quickly as we could. Um, and so we end up signing peace accords with the North Vietnamese. We exit the country, and pretty much as we're withdrawing from the country, the North Vietnamese launch another offensive on the South Vietnamese now that we're gone. And Nixon provides some very limited support to South Vietnam. The problem is he's dealing with the Watergate scandal at this point, and so his attention has been totally diverted from the Vietnam War to the Watergate scandal. And on May 1st, 1975, North Vietnamese tanks roll into Saigon. They knock down the gates of the American embassy. Lots of famous photos of people scrambling to get aboard American helicopters that were the last ones evacuating Saigon. And we evacuate um, a pretty good number of South Vietnamese allies. A lot of them were Montengrad people who helped us up in the mountains, and a lot of them actually ended up settling in parts of North Carolina because a lot of them came in through places like Fort Bragg. There's a photograph. You can see an American punching someone trying to get aboard one of the helicopters. I mean, it was literally the helicopters were taking off as the tanks were rolling in the gates, and you can see the tanks rolling in the gates of the embassy, and that's a stream of people trying to board helicopters to get out. So, what is the impact of Vietnam? The domino theory is false. It doesn't happen. Laos and Cambodia do become communist. However, the rest of Southeast Asia does not. Vets coming back from the war felt like the U.S. government had betrayed them, that they had kind of tied their hands by not letting them fight the war as they needed to fight it, and others said that the public was to blame because they didn't support them. The Veterans Administration stated that about 1/6 of 3 million veterans suffered from PTSD from the war. And then we had ailments from Agent Orange, cancer at birth defects. Um, the other thing too is that you can think about the war contributed to massive internal disorder and the downfall of 2 U.S. presidents. And finally is the War Powers Act, which limited the power a president had when deploying troops overseas without a declaration of war. So this is in reaction to the Gulf of Tonkin, and it stated that a president couldn't deploy troops overseas for more than 60 days without approval of Congress.